Okay. So, let's see what we got here. Five, six, bishop, knight f6, knight, bishop, knight, knight 7. Christ. Well, I must admit, the game doesn't look hot already for Playa 8. um, yeah, usually as a big, you don't really want to like the same multiple times because it means that you're wasting time making moves that aren't as relevant. Hopefully Truplaya8 has me muted, otherwise I'm giving him advice. But just a general principle, you want to develop all of your pieces, not move the same piece like 2 or 3 times. Overall, it's a pretty balanced position, but Playa 8 is taking a lot of time though, that's for sure. Got knight c5, e5, and then a4. Okay. Castles, rook d1. Okay. A8. Moves are flying out of the players. I said that they were taking a lot of time, and now they're not taking any time at all. So, obviously, white neglecting the castle in this position can be okay. You're setting up for an attack, right? Just the problem is that you'll notice that the bishop, knight, and rook on the right side are kind of trapped, not really able to develop. So, and all of his pieces are on the queen side, but his king side pieces are not developed, and black king's on the right side. So not necessarily the best for if you're trying to get an attack. Knight trade, okay, but he's also just so white is trading off one of his only active pieces and then helping black develop by giving him bishop takes d7, which is now attacking the white queen. Once again, losing tempo, right? Not exactly something you want to do. Usually whenever you go for a piece trade, you want to trade one of your weaker pieces for a stronger piece of your opponent. That's why something like a bishop for a rook is usually favorable for the player who loses the bishop and takes the rook. But there are actually cases where a rook is so weak in a position that trading a knight or a bishop for a rook is not as good. Um, it's not very often that's the case, and usually you won't be able to recognize it unless you're at the top level, but it does happen on occasion. White now taking his time. Only got 6 minutes left on the clock to 9 minutes for black. Not great. Okay, queen c2. Moving it back to safety makes sense. Black doesn't have necessarily an obvious game plan. I would say to do right now is probably just start pushing some pawns or trying to get his rook on a8 out, try to get some attacks going. Like I mentioned, white doesn't really have any pieces developed on the side of the board, whereas black has developed 2 bishops, his knight, his rook, and his queen is still standing there, but it's pretty easy out there. White's position. Also, the bishop on e3, really important to notice is that it stops the pawn on e2 from moving forward. So it's really hard to get the light squared bishop out and developed without either moving that bishop out and then moving the pawn up or playing g3. It's actually an okay move. G3 and then moving the bishop to g2. That's called a fianchetto. It'll see across the long diagonal. But that's usually something you want to do early on in the game, not this late. Five, black. Trying to get a pawn break. So I guess a pawn break is basically when you ruin the pawn structure or like just start making pawn trades. That way you can open up the position. So like if white decides to take on c5, then he'll have doubled pawns. I guess if he takes on c5 or e5, he'll have double pawns. And then his pawn chain will be... But it will open up the diagonal for white's bishop. Then we get where c takes d5. Huh. Or c takes d4 rather. Okay. I mean, the position's getting opened up, which usually favors bishop takes d4 and pawn takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Yeah. So white opting to take with the bishop first instead of the pawn. Not sure if that was the best idea, but maybe he's got some tricks up his sleeve. Have to wait and see. Position, according to the engine, is not so hot for white. But look, I've seen bigger throws. Or getting a check, and white now has to block with either the rook or the queen, because the king has nowhere to go. That's why you prioritize king safety and try to castle early. That way you don't just get checked and get attacked, right? So obviously white's going to want to check or block with the rook instead of the queen because they're more powerful. Black does take. I'm assuming white's going to take back with the queen. Though taking back with the king could be okay, because takes back with the king. Oh, and he actually does. Interesting. So taking back with the king can be okay, because if he develops his bishop and knight out of the way, he can actually swing the rook all the way over. File and A file, or the C file, which is also open. But of course, it does open up the king back, as is knight e4 check, and the king moves back. All right. Well, one step forward, two steps back. Yeah. So now basically all black wants to do is just, like I said earlier, start pushing pawns, start developing the queen and the rook, get an attack onto white. I mean, the king is stuck in the center of the board. Like I said, the three pieces are developed. They haven't been touched the entire game. Those four pawns and those three pieces have not made any moves at all. White, which... And there is a little bit of a threat here as well. If white doesn't see it, black can make something happen, but white does block. With knight f3. Finally getting to some development, so not bad. Unfortunately, he can't castle anymore. But that's okay, right? If he plays something like e3, bishop d3, he'll put a little bit of pressure on that knight. Maybe can trade it with the bishop. Trading wouldn't be that great since he's down a rook, but something. Black finally develops that rook, rook c8, attacking the queen, also threatening some nasty attack on the king if the queen were to move an awkward way. We haven't really seen a lot of pawn movement in the game though. Not a lot of pawn movement. We've still got 10 pawns at their starting position, which can be okay. Pawns, they're good, but they aren't always used to checkmate the enemy king, so that's still, you can see that, not moving the pawns for white has been really hard. Has made it really hard, rather, to develop the bishop, develop the rook. Okay. What I was talking about earlier, that open up some nasty attacks if it was not moved properly. Get rook c1 check. King is nowhere to go because the knight is covering d2. And so the only way to survive is for the to go to d1. Forced move. Of course, he trades the rook for the queen to take. And now works with the knight. Two, working the rook. One. Knight takes one. One thing to note about the knight fork is that sometimes it isn't the best move, especially if it happens early on. The knight getting trapped in the corner here can basically make it a dead piece. So if white is able to counterattack and checkmate the enemy king early, then losing that rook doesn't do very much because the knight's stuck in the corner. Obviously, in this case, there really isn't a whole lot for black to worry about. 15 points of material. Add another one, 16 points up. Why not? But I respect Truplaya8 continuing to fight, continuing to push. The game's never over until it's over. There's always a chance, no matter how little. And it's always good to practice too. Practice not only defending a losing game, but also giving your opponent practice on how to actually close out a game. A lot of the time, in online games, the opponent will just sign as soon as they get one bad thing happen to them, and then sometimes people will enter positions that should be won and they just don't know what to do. Sometimes they end up stalemating. But yeah, I mean, this game definitely is hard. Oh, and that was not what you wanted. Oh, yeah, black has checked.
Me.
Well,
Oh, I should have
close.
spiderwebbed on the right earlier. I didn't set it up.
Yeah, that was the
Alright.
fatal mistake.
GG's.